perhaps even someone who raised their hand. What else? Oh, I'd like to thank our media sponsors, the mighty KGNU Community Radio from dear old Boulder right down the road. Tonight we are coming at you live and direct via the World Wide Web, compliments of Longmont Public Media. Thank you, Longmont Public Media. Tonight's program is, as you know, being offered as part of our Thursday Nights at the Museum series. Every Thursday evening we offer a little something, a panel, a lecture, a conversation, a film, a performance, a little bit of everything for everybody. This is our second program of the year. Did I already just say that? Maybe I said that already. We have a great program coming up this Sunday that you should be aware of. It's a documentary film followed by Q&A. It's called The Longest Walk, and it's about the life and work of the great Charlie Burrell, also known as the Jackie Robinson of classical music. Played for the Denver Symphony for some 40 years and was very involved in the jazz scene in 5 Points. That's this Sunday at 2:30. Anyway, without further ado, I should mention, if you haven't been here for a while, you may have noticed that we've developed kind of a growth out here to the north in the parking lot. That is, don't worry, don't be afraid. It is a new gallery. We are building a 4,000 square foot gallery along with a new entrance. It's super exciting. It's scheduled to be complete this summer. We just got our front doors put in today, which is pretty exciting. So stay tuned for more of that. We're going to continue to grow here. Tonight's program, ladies and gentlemen. So it's 2026, if you didn't know, and that means someone's got a big old birthday coming up. Yep, I'm talking about our sweet land of liberty in all its purple mountain majesty, the United States of America. As such, and in the absence of an exhibition to take inspiration from, we're taking a page out of the PBS playbook and exploring the American experience a bit this winter and spring, from film to live performances to conversations, which brings us to tonight's program. I could be wrong, but it sure seems like making your way in the world today takes everything you've got. That taking a break from all your worries sure would help a lot. Wouldn't you like to get away? Sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name, and they're always glad you came. You want to be where you can see our troubles are all the same. You want to be where everybody knows your name. And what's my name? It's nostalgia, and its pull is strong. Can you feel it? Yes, we're here to talk about the allure, the siren song of a return to the good old days. Remember them? Back when things were simpler, easier, less stressful. Back when the world was an episode of Cheers, Happy Days, or gosh darn it, The Andy Griffith Show. Back when the world just made sense. We live in a time of rapid change. The last 30 years have been absolutely disorienting. Believe me, that's how they felt to me. To use a farming term, things have gone a little haywire. We live in incredibly stressful and increasingly divisive times. Our collective desire for some kind of change or relief is immense, and something I believe we all have in common. But it seems there's some difference in opinion about the source of our stress and how we should go about finding relief from it. One particular and fairly popular approach is to return us all to a time when America was really just great. But can we all agree on when that was exactly and what it looked like? If I could turn back time right this second, and I would live out the remainder of my days in the 90s. I might be a product of the 70s and 80s, but the 90s were my decade. And if you're curious, my 90s looked a lot like Richard Linklater's Slacker film, filled with indie rock, thrift stores, boho coffee houses, outsider art, public radio, poetry, philosophy, and girls and cigarettes. Maybe not the great America you've been pining for, but man, for me, those were the days. Nostalgia plays a powerful and often paradoxical role in American culture. It's both an emotional refuge and a political force, a personal coping mechanism and a collective narrative tool. Understanding why it's so potent requires looking at both American history and our own psychological wiring, which is why we've invited some fellows This is not the man show, by the way, in case you're wondering, who know a thing or two about such things. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome our panelists this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, on the extreme right over there is Mr. Greg Dickinson. He holds the William E. Morgan Endowed Professor, serves as the interim chair of art and art history, and is the founding director of the Joe Blake Center for Engaged Humanities at Colorado State University. He is an award-winning scholar and teacher whose work advances critical and theoretical understanding of memory, place, materiality, race, gender, and everyday life. He has published in communication, cultural studies, and rhetoric journals on coffee shops, shopping malls, museums, and gentrified urban spaces. He has co-authored, authored, and co-edited 5 books, and his scholarship has earned numerous awards. Ladies and gentlemen, Greg Dickinson. In the middle, Dr. Shanti, it's Zaid. Zaid, thank you. Is an independent scholar, lecturer, and works at Denver's Blair-Caldwell African American Research Library, offering museum tours and public historical programming on the Black experience in the Rocky Mountain West. He has a background in university teaching and international research on African diaspora, sacred traditions, and earned doctorate degrees in African American and African Studies and Cultural Anthropology from Michigan State University. Dr. Shanti Zaid. Jeremy Morton, to his left, is an exhibition developer and historian at the History Colorado Center. Formerly, he was History Colorado's public engagement manager and education coordinator for community museums. He's a 90s kid, born and raised in Denver. Jeremy grew up frequenting the Via Italia Mall. I'm from LA, so if it's V-I-L-L-A, it's Villa, okay, Villa Italia Mall, ladies and gentlemen. He went on to graduate from the University of Colorado, Denver, with a Bachelor of Arts in History and a Master of Arts in Curriculum and Instruction. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeremy Morton. So we're going to start things off with a little sort of history and origin of the term nostalgia. Greg is going to start us off with that. Greg?
Great, thanks, Justin. Thanks for having us here and for taking the time to organize this. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what Shanti and Jeremy has to say. And so I'll try to be quiet as soon as possible so that other people can talk. And thank you for coming as well. On a Thursday evening, I'm sure there are other things you could do, like watch an old TV show, for example. But you're here, and so let's have a great conversation. As you heard, I'm a professor, and so I'm gonna sound like a professor for a while. I hope that's kind of fun. It's fun for me. History. Oh, I did that too fast. Hang on a second. A history of nostalgia. Turns out this term is kind of old. In a kind of nostalgic mode, a Swiss doctor defined the term in the 17th century. From 2 Greek words, nos and algia. Algia meaning discomfort or longing or hurt or pain, and nos, return or return to home. And so he wrote about this in his dissertation in Basel, Switzerland. Everything I say, as far as I know, is true. I wasn't there, but I believe it to be true. And he's writing in particular about an experience that people were increasingly having, this is centuries ago. Justin put this in terms of, hey, the world's changed really a lot in the last 30 years. I want to say that this worry about change is really old. The people he was writing about in particular were Swiss mercenary soldiers who would leave the lands of Switzerland to go fight in other countries. As you probably know, they were the best paid best trained mercenaries around Europe, and so folks would hire them, French or the British or whomever would hire them, and they'd be away from home for a very long time, and they'd get really sick. And in fact, the symptoms of nostalgia were things like fainting, high fever. People were said to die from nostalgia, that it could actually kill you. And there were various kinds of ways of getting cured from this. You could have leeches attached to you. But the best thing was to return home, of course, and get a sense of sustenance. This notion of nostalgia has kind of stayed with us ever since then. It's changed over time. But one of the things that's happening in this, certainly by the 18th and 19th century, is a real sense of increasingly rapid change. We think our world is changing quickly now, and to some extent, it's the change of the rate of change, if that makes any sense. So even if we look back to 100 years ago and say things weren't changing very fast then, it doesn't matter to them 100 years ago whether I think it was fast. What matters to them is whether it felt fast to them. And so we have this kind of rapid change of modernity. The growth, for example, of cities. Sometime in the late 19th century, the Western world becomes primarily urban. And the city kind of remakes our relationship with each other and with time and with space. And Svetlana Baum, who writes a really important book, quite easy to read. She's a poet and an artist and a historian. And she writes this book in English, having immigrated from Russia and thinking about, in the 1980s, and thinking about her own experiences. She talks about how in the 19th and 20th century there's a loss of what she calls, here's a big word, eschatological time. And eschatological time is the time, that sense that we're moving towards a clear and definite end, kind of biblical end. And we also have a sense of loss of space or place, that sense of being connected to a very particular place. So some of us have even had this experience even in our own lives, but certainly in the 19th or 18th century, it wouldn't be at all unusual to not move more than a few miles from where you were born. You knew everybody, and everybody knew everybody else. I kind of grew up like that in a little tiny town of Walla Walla, Washington, which is why I don't live there anymore. So there is a kind of hope that's in modernity that says maybe I want newness, but that newness causes some disconcert. Is disconcerting. Bohm writes, what is crucial is that nostalgia was not merely an expression of local longing, that is to say, the longing for a very specific home, the home I grew up in, but a result of a new understanding of time and space that made division into local and universal possible. That sense that I'm not just in my own local space, but that there's kind of this increasingly large world that's impinging upon me, that I have access to, but that also might be somewhat disconcerting. Okay, just a couple more things. One of the ways that we know, I'm just going to go kind of philosophical here for a moment. One of the ways in which we know who we are is that we know when we are and we know where we are. We know when in time we are, what historical lineage we have, and we know what space we are in. We have some sense of the location. But what modernity and postmodernity and late modernity does is it makes it harder and harder for us to know where we are. I'll give you a couple of examples. You could be in a housing development. I drove here from Fort Collins, and I drove through suburban developments in Loveland and in Longmont, and I could drive through more of them to Denver, and they all look exactly the same. So where am I? Am I in Longmont? Am I in Colorado? I could drive to Los Angeles, in suburban Los Angeles. They look very similar there as well. And I'm not always sure where I am in time. What are the historical pushes and pulls in my life? What lineage am I a part of? Those are unclear to us in a way that wasn't unclear when I was a young person in Walla Walla, Washington, where everybody knew my family and I knew exactly where I belonged. Nostalgia then is this affect, this feeling, this emotion, this desire to return back home. Crucially, it's almost never a desire for the actual home. I go home regularly. My father still lives in the home that I lived in. I'm happy to leave in about 2.5 days. I'm nostalgic for a fantasized sense of knowing where and when I belonged. Having a sense that all the things that I do will be fine because everybody will understand them the way that I understand them. The last thing I want to say here, and then I'm going to hand it off, is that this sense of nostalgia. We'll come back to this. This sense of nostalgia is something that can both pull us together and push us apart. This is Svetlana Bohem's idea. It's not mine. I'm citing my sources. That sense of longing is something many of us can resonate with. That wish that I could be at Cheers or wherever that is that feels like home. But what home is so different for each one of us. That fantasy of home. Whose home? When we say we want an America that looked like it used to look, to whom? For whom? Which story is it that we're telling? So that desire to be in some place that's familiar is familiar to all of us. What constitutes as familiar and comfortable is different among all of us. And so I think we're going to spend some time tonight thinking about that difficult tension between the desire to be in a time and a place that's familiar and the recognition that that familiarity is always going to be a separation from other people for whom that very same thing won't be familiar. Okay, a quick example, Disneyland. Disneyland is actually based on Fort Collins. How many of you knew that? Oh, some of you did. Right on. That's cool. Disney Main Street in 1955 is based on Walt Disney's hometown for a while of Merceline, Iowa, and Fort Collins, Colorado. 19-teens, 1920s, 1930s, a guy by the name of Harper Goff lives in Fort Collins. He becomes a designer for Disney and Disneyland, and they develop the Main Street out of this. This is a picture from 1891. Harper Goff isn't there yet. But you see up there that kind of cupola up there, that shows up, I'm going to show you again, that shows up in Disneyland Main Street. Now, I'm talking about the Anaheim Disneyland, not all the other ones, just that one, okay? So this is a Main Street. Here we are. This no longer exists. That cupola still exists. You can go to the bookstore that's right underneath that, Old Firehouse Books. Come along and buy a book. That'd be great. This round here is College Avenue and LaPorte and turns into Walnut. That's not there anymore. I shouldn't show this picture. I don't have copyright to do so. Disney is very, very, very careful with their copyright, so don't tell anybody that I did this. But there you have it. There's the round. There's the streetcar. There's the cupola. 1955. If you think, so here's Disney saying, here's the happiest place on earth, based on a Main Street, kind of Midwest Main Street vision that reminded us of a hometown that probably many of us don't actually want to live in. But when we think about going to a theme park, a fantasy land seems pretty cool.
Thanks, Greg.
Wow, I'm still transfixed by the
Yeah, me too.
presentation. Oh, all right. How do you go? Skipping ahead. All right.
Oh, that's my last picture.
There we go. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming. As was said, I work at the Blair-Caldwell African American Research Library, and we're a pretty unique library in Denver in that we have an archive and special collection there around the Black experience in the West, as well as a museum. And so for this presentation, I pulled a few things from our collection to highlight some of the roles of nostalgia. I want to focus tonight on nostalgia in African Americans, which has kind of a distinctive relationship, and open up some of the discrepancies that can be there that were mentioned. So thinking about nostalgia and the kind of warm and fuzzy feeling that it brings, the kind of respite it can bring from anxiety and complex emotions around the contemporary moment, and trying to find solace in some of those memories, and whether they're real or have been kind of romanticized over time. And so some historical thinking with that, with nostalgia, it has one level on the personal level that we can relate to, with things that we grew up with and finding solace in that. I know for me, at a personal level, if I'm feeling real, I need those warm and fuzzies, I will watch this movie from the 80s called Never Ending Story. And it heals my heart every time. Right, but then there's also these kind of national memories that we hearken back to as well that are part of broader narratives and national narratives. And for Black folks, a lot of times those kind of national spaces of nostalgia are really inaccessible. They're not very comfortable. And largely that's because at various eras of US history, it has incorporated or included a lot of different iterations of racism, of racial oppression, of racial violence, of racial exploitation. And so that can make reminiscing certain moments in the past very difficult when those paths are informed by so much trauma. And so there's an interesting relationship that Black folks have with national examples of nostalgia. And so I have a few pictures here. I thought I would start with the Roaring '20s, right, as one era of hearkening back to a moment of high fashion and excitement and world of possibilities that has that kind of symbolic value in a lot of people's minds. But for African Americans, the 20s were what Black studies scholars call the nadir. They were part of the nadir of Black history. That is the lowest point. This is a time where Black life tended to mean the least in US history. A time of pretty extreme violence, where lynchings were a regular occurrence, were sometimes celebrated in public, and where there was extreme exploitation as slavery became kind of reinterpreted after the end of the official slavery. And so there's a lot of images in the popular culture of the time that express those kind of, a kind of nostalgic reworking of what Blackness is, but asserted onto that community. And so at the time where there were flappers and jazz was coming out and there was all these parties and things, some of the ubiquitous kind of objects around were something like on the top left there, that is toothpaste, a box of toothpaste, Darky toothpaste, right? And we can see on the front there, there's a minstrel kind of figure there. And the toothpaste highlighting how white the teeth are against the dark skin. That's kind of the thing, right? But it's also an image that is meant to it's meant to suppress Blackness. It's meant to reinterpret that, right? It's hearkening to a kind of entertainment where everybody is happy to entertain. And this is at the same time where a lot of the famous jazz musicians couldn't enter the clubs through the front door that they were performing in, couldn't eat at those clubs, had to be hidden kind of away from everything. And Black folks couldn't attend many of those clubs because the law of the land was segregation. All right, so there's kind of sharp contrast. Also a time where the Klan was very prominent. Right, and the Klan were the Klan was really launched and propelled into a new kind of popularity following the success of a film called Birth of a Nation, which there's an image of the cover of it there. This was a film that really leaned into romanticizing the past. It was set in Reconstruction era America. And the heroes of the film that were coming in to save the day were the Ku Klux Klan. And all of the villains were these corrupt or lazy or violent black men. And this film was wildly successful in the United States in the teens and into the 20s. In some places, it was in theaters for years. And this is also occurring at a time when a lot of immigrants are coming in from different parts of Europe, right? And they're looking to this new country and trying to get a handle on what are the values here, what is this place about, how can I fit in here? And they go to see this exciting new technology called films, and this exciting new film that's using all these crazy new techniques and really telling a story well. And they're, in addition to getting entertained, they're also being socialized into these are the values of the country, this is what it means to fit in. And as a result, Klan membership explodes across the country. And Colorado was particularly attracted to this narrative, where in the 1920s, Colorado had the second highest Klan membership in the entire country, second only to Indiana. Right, and so a very dangerous time to be black and to do anything. Right, and so that level of discrepancy, and then when those moments get memorialized and romanticized, it is also a part of an erasure or a denying of that history, another way of not engaging it that it happened. Right, and this is something that is a recurring theme over time. Another kind of popular culture example is romanticizing the South, with the film Gone with the Wind being one of the key examples of that. An Oscar-winning film, incidentally featured an actress named Hattie McDaniel, who was also a Colorado local, grew up in Five Points, not too far away from where our library is. And became the first black woman to win an Academy Award for Gone with the Wind for playing the role of the Mammy. And in this role, she received a lot of critique from people for like, you know, perpetuating these stereotypes of the Mammy, right? Romanticizing slavery in a way that made it seem like black folks were happy to be a part of it. Enjoyed it. They were there to help and offer wisdom and all of these things. And not entirely appreciating that even at that time, not only just romanticizing slavery, but at that time in the 40s, the only roles for black women at that time were mammies. There were no other options if you wanted to be an actress and you were black. She would take that and played into that nostalgia on one hand, but then on the other hand took her success and opened up many other roles that black women could play in Hollywood, and ended up starring in a lot of jazz films and World War II films and all kinds of stuff. And so it being a little bit more complex. But this kind of romanticizing of the past, not engaging the violence, not engaging a lot of the truths of it, and particularly not engaging the communities that were impacted by those things. And then I thought I would throw in another example of the political use of nostalgia. I was reminded of a song that I really enjoyed growing up. It's by a musician and poet named Gil Scott-Heron. He wrote a song called B-Movie, and this was trying to capture the moment that Reagan had come into political power. And he framed this robust poem in B-Movie around the idea that America was having difficulty facing the future and was leaning into nostalgia. They needed nostalgia. And was looking for a cowboy figure to come in and ride in and save the day. And what he highlights in the poem is that John Wayne wasn't available at the time, and so they settled for Ronald Reagan. But playing into that cowboy role and the savior and all of those things in this political sense, again romanticizing this moment that on its the flip side of that coin coincided with the genocide of Native Americans and an annihilation of the buffalo across the land and this radical transformation of the entire geography of this portion of North America. But leaning into it and getting those warm and fuzzies going, and then kind of perpetuating a lot of those things. So those are some of some ideas around some of the traumas and abuses that can be there with nostalgia. But I also wanted to spend a moment to talk about what nostalgia is for the Black community, right? If so much of the past is informed by so much trauma, what can be what can generate some of those warm and fuzzy feelings within a community that has that? And so in this, I wanted to share the concept of Afro nostalgia, which is something that an author whose name I have not memorized, Badia Ahad Lagarde, has just coined recently in a book entitled Afro Nostalgia, really highlighting that when the national narratives are not accessible, people will go internal to communities and kind of build nostalgia within communities and within cultural traditions. And so we can see nostalgia play out at some different levels within the Black community. For example, at a national level, addressing the erasure of a past for Black people, which it was erased for a very long time. And trying to reclaim that past, if we can see in the top left image, this mural that's a part of our collection, that's highlighting African kings. In this case, it's Egyptian kings, some other parts of Africa there, highlighting the royalty, which is in a sense invoking nobility in the past, a respectfulness in the past, and filling that void or worse, right? Filling some of those missing ideas with respectable places, and then generating a nostalgia for that, even if there's no like genetic relationship or lines are difficult to trace, but leaning into that level of nostalgia. Another area is inserting Black experiences into popular forms of nostalgia. And so that Western romanticized cowboy aesthetic is also something that has been tapped into for Black folks, especially in the West. And so in the top right there's a couple pictures. One is of a comic from the 60s that's tried to share some insights into Black cowboys as historical figures. And another famous photo from a Denver photographer that became famous in the 1930s called the Smiling Cowhand. This was actually an award-winning photograph in 1939 and featured in the World Fair the following year. But inserting inside of an established area of nostalgia, but altering and changing the narrative inside of that. And then just some examples of community building and documenting these moments of joy as a source of nostalgia. And so these bottom photographs here are from the same photographer. His name is Bernice McLeod. And that's his camera there. These photos are from an exhibit that we recently did on Bernice McLeod and his capturing of 5 points in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. And just highlighting some cases of, these are some social clubs and social groups that were gathering and having fun, right? But these kind of images were not they were not common. And so Denver Black community was really fortunate to have a kind of resident photographer taking so many photographs of things that the community then has to kind of feel nostalgia for afterwards. And I wanted to end with this last picture there of that, what looks like a factory worker, but it's actually a shoe shop. And this was featured in our exhibit, and I remember giving a tour through the exhibit, and one of the members of the tour saw that picture of that woman working in the machine there and broke down in tears off of the nostalgia that it was generating, because she remembered growing up around that shoe shop, and she remembered how kind the owner of the shoe shop was. And going there as a little kid, and he remembered her name and would always talk to her, and it brought so much emotion seeing that picture, and it was kind of a hard encounter for her because it was so distant. It just evoked this thing really it evoked some deep sensations for her. But it was a part of that nostalgic relationship, but also the distance from that kind of feeling that she had at the time. And so inside of our museum and the work that we do, we're constantly trying to balance those nostalgic sentiments, balance the picture, the real history, but also trying to capture some of the joys inside of that. And I give you that as a segue to some museum stuff.
Perfect. Can I snag the clicker? Gonna have to do the clicker in the right and the mic in the left here. All right. We don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to get right into it. I'm Jeremy Morton. I'm an exhibition developer, and I'm going to talk a bit about nostalgia in museums. I think Shanti did such a great job talking about the dangers and pitfalls of nostalgia, and I'll touch on those a little bit, but I'm for the most part going to focus on the benefits of nostalgia from a museum perspective. When we're talking about nostalgia in history museums in particular, it's inevitable. You're going to have nostalgia in a history museum setting. When your job is to talk about the past, the present, imagine futures, you're going to have nostalgia. So the question then isn't, should we exclude nostalgia from the museum or should we include nostalgia in the museum? The question is, how do we utilize nostalgia within the museum setting? And in my experience, it is possible to create successful events and exhibitions that lean heavily into nostalgia. You just need to be aware of those pitfalls that Shanti alluded to. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about one event that I've done at the History Colorado Center that leaned heavily into nostalgia, and then one exhibition that leaned heavily into nostalgia as well. So when I started at the History Colorado Center, I showed up and they said, Jeremy, you've got 3 months to create an event that attracts young adults. And this was a tall task for me, coming from an exhibition or education background and having never coordinated a large event in my life before. So the concept we ended up landing on was the Oregon Trail IRL. And when I'm talking about the Oregon Trail, we're not talking about the actual Oregon Trail. We're talking about the computer game that was invented in the late 70s and then became immensely popular in the 80s and the 90s, and it was so popular that many schools actually used it to help teach history. And because it was, the majority of students experienced this game, it became this sort of nostalgic touchstone for many people of that generation. And so we thought, let's tap into that nostalgia to get young adults within the museum by creating a real life experience of this video game. And that's where the IRL comes for. That means in real life. So that's exactly what we did. We created a live action Oregon Trail. We actually did it 3 separate times, and to my great relief, it sold out the first time. So I was able to succeed. It sold out all 3 times, actually, with 555 tickets sold and over 600 people in the building. And again, the main goal here was to attract a sort of new demographic that we weren't really getting at the museum at the time. And after one of the events, we did a survey. 53% people responded from the survey. And you'll see in this pie chart, the most common response to the question of how often they'd visited in the last year was 40% of them said they had never been to the History Colorado Center. They might not have even known what History Colorado was or that we existed at all. And then the second most popular response was they had been, but it had been more than a year. So 70% of the people that were attending this event had either never been, never heard of us, or had not been in years. So in that sense, it was a huge success for the museum as far as getting people into the building, a new audience. And that audience was those young adults that we were looking for. Over 80% of the people that responded to this survey were from the ages of 26 to 45. And I did want to talk a little bit about how we recreated this sort of live action experience. So if you remember the Oregon Trail video game, you remember there were three main elements. There was fording the river, and sometimes failing to ford the river and drowning in the river. There was hunting, and then there was dying of random diseases. These were the games we played as children. So we had to figure out, how do we do a river crossing in a history museum? And this was the most popular way that we did it, probably the most popular part of the event. We filled a long, narrow, about 60-foot long hallway with 2 to 3 feet of blue athletic foam, and people had to trudge through in order to cross one of the rivers. So this is some photos of people. Well, people did die at the game, not literally though. This is, you got to get creative. You can't bring an actual river into the museum. So one of the ways we created a river crossing was we lit up our largest conference room with blew up lights, and we brought in human-sized hamster balls, and you had to struggle your way from one end of the conference room and back. And then hunting, if you showed up at the event, you got a Nerf gun, and then we placed life-size animals throughout our museum and exhibits that you got to hunt. And then dying of random diseases. How do you represent that in a live action form? Well, you could get Colorado Parks and Wildlife to come and talk about the dangers of snake bites and bring live snakes and things like that. Or you could hire improv actors. And if you bumped into them, they give you a button that says, this is how you died of dysentery or measles. We had pioneers giving you measles or dysentery. Or we had a snarky snake here who'd tell you he's handing a button to that woman there saying she's died of a snake bite. And like I said, we did this 3 times, and it was so successful. The first time, then leadership comes to you and says, hey, do it again.
They're asking me to do it here. So yeah.
So when you do repeating an event, you try to figure out, we're going to have people coming back. How can we differentiate it? How can we improve it? And I actually found out that one of the co-creators of the Oregon Trail, a guy named Don Rawich, the guy in the denim jacket in this photo here, actually lives in Loveland. He lives very close to here. So I was able to track down Don. I told him what we're doing, and he came down for the second event. And it was actually a very touching moment as he saw, hundreds of people, filing into the building to relive something he created. He enjoyed it so much that he actually talked one of his co-creators, Paul Dillenberger, into flying down from Minnesota for the third event. And this is him, talking about Oregon Trail to some of the visitors. And then, we were leaning into the nostalgia. We knew the nostalgia was the pull to get people into the building. So one time we had an opportunity to recreate a sort of 80s, 90s classroom. Now, but this is really what it's all about. This is what I call sneaking in the spinach. And if you're an educator, you come from a teacher background, you know exactly what sneaking in the spinach means. That's when you get your students so excited, having so much fun, and the energy's so high that they don't even realize they're learning. And then you sneak in the spinach. You sneak in the core learning objectives. You sneak in those difficult stories that Shanti mentioned are so important to talk about. And so this is a woman, you could tell she's at Oregon Trail because her Nerf gun is loaded and ready. But she is in our Zoom In exhibit reading, I think, about the Democratic National Convention in Denver in 2008. So we thought, let's get some activities that draw people into our exhibitions. And once they're in there, they're going to stop. They're going to read. They're going to learn, hopefully. We could sneak in some spinach, at the Oregon Trail. Now, at the same time, it is very important, as Shanti talked about, that things like the Oregon Trail glossed over these difficult parts of our past. So you're trying to tap into the nostalgia, you're trying to sneak in the spinach, you're trying to get the general public into your museum, and we're mainly talking just about the computer game, but we felt like it was also important for us to point out that the Oregon Trail is bound to manifest destiny in this idea, this sort of racist and imperialistic ideology. So when you came to that event, you got a booklet, and on the very first page was this message that, speaking to manifest destiny and kind of prompting people to think about, it's a hard discussion that some of our favorite movies or TV shows or video games from the past often glossed over the violence of the past. So that was the Oregon Trail IRL. And then this was the exhibition I recently did called The 90s, Last Decade Before the Future. And so for this, our goal was to tell the story of an entire decade. And it's a difficult task to distill an entire decade down to 5,000 square feet of exhibit space. So one of the ways we did that was we had about a 12 by 12 foot space that was dedicated to each room, or to each year. And then each year had to be distilled down to 12 to 18 events to summarize that year. And the danger with doing an exhibition like this, especially one focused on, very high level, just, a summary of an entire decade, you can't dive too deep into it, and you kind of have to focus on the mainstream history. And if you're telling a mainstream history, it could very easily become whitewashed. And so our thought there when coming up with the timeline was we need to involve our staff members of color, we need to contact community members, and we asked them, what were the most important things that happened for you in the 90s, so that when we told the story of the 90s, everyone was represented, that everyone could see themselves within the exhibition. That's always a goal for us at the History Colorado Center. We want everyone who walks in the door to feel like their story is being told, so that if you're an Asian American person or a black person or an indigenous person or a Latino person, a white person coming through the 90s, you felt like your experience of the 90s was represented within the exhibition. And at the same time, the timeline is where we were able to deal with those difficult, hard parts of the 90s. But at the same time, we needed to realize, the majority of people who are coming to a 90s exhibit are thinking pop culture. They're thinking nostalgia. How do we honor that? And one of the ways we did that was through sort of vignettes and immersive scenes. So right here we have, the bulky computer desk that so many of us had in the 90s. We recreated a generic 90s living room with that monster Magnavox TV. If any of you had to try to move one of those, your back's still probably recovering. And then, this is the most important thing. This is the power of nostalgia right here. This is a woman with her son in that generic 90s living room. The main benefit of nostalgia is it makes you want to recreate those childhood memories, those valued memories you have of the past. Think about, valued memories you have of the past, whether it's, going to the Civic Center and seeing the Christmas lights, or going to the movies with a family member, going camping, whatever it is, you think about that, but then you're not just stuck there. You think, how do I recreate that for my nieces, nephews, kids, grandkids, and so on? This is a woman, this is a Magic Eye book. This is how we entertained ourselves in the 90s. And this is another way. We had a case full of old ticket stubs. And so often you would see people over the ticket stubs like, oh, yeah, like I was at that concert. Oh, it rained so much at Red Rocks that night. I missed the physical ticket stubs, right? And it's not just that these people are fondly remembering their past. They're also thinking, like going to live music was such a core part of my identity for so long. I haven't been to a concert in so long. I need to go to more concerts. Or they're thinking, who was with me at that concert at Red Rocks? So-and-so. I need to text them. I haven't talked to them in so long. And in that sense, nostalgia has this serious potential to create pro-social behavior and strengthen relationships. And we had nostalgic video games. We had an interactive board where you could argue what was the best 90s song. This was our most popular part. That's me right there, very proud. One of the through lines of the 90s was how we came from an analog past to a digital future, and the change in technology, the rapid change in technology in the 90s. And so we wanted to talk about VHS to DVD to ultimately to Netflix and streaming. And what better way to do that than to recreate an old Blockbuster video that brought us so many nostalgic memories. And these are some of the objects from the exhibit. I'll gloss over those because I know I'm a little over on time. So we did collect data as people left the exhibition, and overwhelmingly the people experienced nostalgia. Nostalgia is what brought people in the door. And once they're in the 90s, odds are they're not just going to go see the 90s. Odds are they're going to explore our other exhibitions, our more heavy-hitting exhibitions. Maybe after they go to the 90s, they head up to our exhibition on the Sand Creek Massacre, or they learn about Lincoln Hills and the Green Book and segregation, or they learn about Amache and Japanese internment, or El Movimiento and the Chicano movement. Or even within the 90s, these serious issues of progress for civil rights, and in particular the progress made in LGBTQ plus rights in the 90s. All of these things, they're ways of sort of sneaking in the spinach. But I like to say, if nobody comes to the museum, nobody learns anything. So our primary goal needs to be getting people in the door, and once they're in the door, we could reach those sort of core learning objectives. And so more, nostalgia brought people, that's what they experienced. And there was affirming feedback, that the themes of the 90s, it wasn't just they got their selfie in the Blockbuster and left, the communication of the technology, the growth of the Denver Metro and the Front Range in the 90s, the progress made in civil rights, the reshaping of geopolitics, and these were issues that we were able to bring to people, but only once they were in the museum. So just to recap, there are serious dangers of nostalgia in museums when it's done incorrectly. There's this potential to present a romanticized history, this sort of rose-tinted past that glosses over or even ignores the difficult, problematic issues of the past. And if you do that, you're more likely to encourage in-group, out-group type of thinking. And if you get people thinking us and them, then they're primed to be manipulated into extreme and hateful ideologies. But at the same time, from a museum professional perspective, we should see museums or see nostalgia as a powerful tool for us to use to get people in the door, and then we can actually reach some of these harder issues. And beyond that, it reaches a different demographic than history museums are often able to reach. And then I could probably speak to this more in our panel, but I believe it strengthens personal identity, and it improves existential meaning for people. And then at its best, like I alluded to, it promotes pro-social behavior and relationships. Thank you.
Thank you. So nostalgia is not good or bad. It just is, right? And we all experience it. Who doesn't experience nostalgia? Everyone does. It's kind of a human. It's part of the human experience. How do we protect ourselves from the misuse of nostalgia? How would you say we do that? Any thoughts?
What kind of misuse of nostalgia are you thinking?
Oh, well, nostalgia. Oh boy. I have to tread lightly. Well, I think, there is there are approaches to, basically, we live in a very anxious time, right? And there is one of the things on offer is a kind of return to when things were good or better. How do we make sure that we're not manipulated by that? How would you say that we sort of?
Well,
how do we watch? How do we stay watchful? Know your history.
Yeah, for sure. Knowing your history. might start at a slightly different angle, and just thinking through nostalgia as at a personal level, and the way that it can, as things become difficult, as things change and become so unfamiliar. I remember reading something that said the United States and kind of the world, but definitely the United States is one of the few places around where intergenerational intergenerational knowledge is very difficult to share. Like one generation has a lot of difficulty sharing knowledge with the next generation because so much change has happened. It's almost an unrecognizable world between generations. And that makes things like, all of these life skills and things you've cultivated over the years very difficult to share with kids or especially grandkids because it's such a very different environment. And so with that pace of change, that kind of radical change, it can feel very, very disorienting and make any kinds of nostalgia very, very comfortable to reach to sit in. And I know at a personal level, there was kind of a whole time period, maybe, mid to late 20s into the 30s, where like I was leaning hard into the nostalgia and listening to a lot of old music and watching old movies and really trying to find those places of comfort. But it became damaging to me because it became an escape rather than a comfort. And then you started to get kind of more and more locked into a time period that wasn't contemporary, that wasn't things happening around. And so I had to really make a self-conscious choice to exit that space and to really try to engage the world as it was. And doing that in different ways, trying to encounter some of the stuff that was difficult, but in kind of pop culture ways, thinking about music. I was leaning very heavy into stuff I was growing up with in my teens, stuff from the 90s.
We just want examples, a couple examples, please. You already mentioned Never Ending Story, just a couple examples. Just need a couple examples.
Well, I definitely like a lot of old Prince and Michael Jackson, a lot of 90s hip hop, Wu-Tang Clan, and different groups.
Thank you.
I was fortunate enough that, some of the pop culture trends were trending back to those, playing into that nostalgia. So I remember Alicia Keys released an album that was hearkening to the 80s that was like really resonated with me at that time. So realizing kind of the depth that I was slipping into the escape part of nostalgia and being alarmed by that set me on a different path to really try to if not embrace, at least understand and develop an appreciation for stuff that was contemporary. And so one of those examples for music was spending a lot of time listening to new music, which I absolutely hated. I forced myself to listen for like an hour to a playlist of the top 50 songs of that week, and it gave me the most raging headache I had ever had. But then, I found some other artists that, had styles that were a little more familiar and I could kind of ease in. And really after a few years, quite a few years maybe, I started appreciating things that were contemporary. I started embracing some of the newer artists and what they were doing and how they were doing it. So that in the last few years, I've actually really enjoyed quite a few albums that have come out, and I find that as a tremendous source of pride. As I talk to some of my friends, and I can't get them out of the 90s for conversations and things. And so kind of pushing through some of those discomforts is one of the paths around that.
So look forward instead of looking backward.
Exactly, yeah.
Embracing the future, embracing now and the future.
But critically so. Critically
Right.
so.
Sure.
You know, it was more like recognizing the danger and trying to navigate out of that, to be less susceptible to getting played through nostalgia.
And what do you think was keeping you there? Was there a fear of embracing the new? I mean, I guess it was just new and different and strange.
Well, it was those changes.
Yeah,
It was
change.
those changes.
Fear of change or something like that. No?
I mean, fear of change is one dynamic. Just not even a fear, but like a difficulty of keeping up. Right. I remember considering in college a degree in computer science, because everybody was like, "This is where things are. This is the future, where the future is." And then I talked to somebody in computer science, and they're like, "Everything I learned 2 years ago is obsolete, and I'm still in the computer program right now." Yeah, I'll share the mic with some other folks.
Anybody want to pick up on that?
One of the things that I've been thinking about as you were talking, Shanti, is if nostalgia is kind of a hope for a return to home, but we don't want to get stuck there. I'm trying to remember the name of the philosopher, French philosopher. He wrote a book about home, but one of the things he writes about home, first of all, I want to be really clear that home is the most dangerous place for us to be. And so the nostalgia for home is always already wrong. So it's just important to kind of put that on.
Home is the most dangerous place to be?
Yeah, I mean, most interpersonal violence happens in the home. Most injuries happen in the home. So we want to be really careful just to start there, to really be thoughtful about that. But home, when it works right, can be the comfort from which we can can move out into the world. So perhaps there's a role for that sense of, I need to have some place that I feel okay, some place that's not risky, and I can draw on that sense of security there, to which I can also return maybe an honest or an authentic security. But that allows me the grounding to go out and experience something that I'm not familiar with. That does make me anxious. This is what you talk about in the museum. I come to the 90s thing. I come to Oregon Trail game. And then I have to think, but the Oregon Trail game is about the destruction of indigenous people. Or maybe I do, but maybe there's enough comfort there that I can do that. I'll just drop a little, you probably know this from your anthropology training. Renato Rosaldo, who's a very famous cultural anthropologist, came up with the term, he called it imperialist nostalgia. We kill the culture and then we return it as a fantasy. You've experienced this in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So that being really thoughtful about the ways in which we use the comfort of home to provide us the security by which we can move back out into the future or into interactions with people that we might be less familiar with. That might be one way of thinking that relationship.
Anything to add to that, Jeremy? You want to take it in another direction?
Sure. No, I think it was a good summary. Yeah. I guess I could say, I think there is like this sort of future thinking that goes along with nostalgia, that I think people generally think of nostalgia, or when people think of nostalgia in a negative light, they tend to think of it kind of like you were talking about, where, I'm getting stuck in the past, and it's kind of viewed as this antithesis of progress. And the more I think about it, the more I think it actually kind of takes us into thinking about the future, of thinking about how we could sort of create a world that takes the best parts of home that we remember if we were lucky enough to have those beneficial homes, and then bring them to other people. And so I think nostalgia is often viewed as this sort of individual, internal thing, and I think it should be more thought of as a sort of external tool that people could use for personal development.
Yeah, I like the idea of it being kind of a touchstone or something, a way to, something to connect back to, an anchor almost. Right?
Yeah, you had talked about sort of almost kind of like the self-narrative that people have, the thought of home, the fantasy of home that you have. And there's comfort in that, even if it is a fantasy, it gives people a sort of place in the world. In some of the surveys that we collected from people exiting the 90s, there were these responses of people who were surprised at how emotional they got in this relatively lighthearted exhibition. That there were tears shed in that blockbuster, and I think the reason that happened is because so often when we think of history, when we think of the past, we think of the distant past. We think of hundreds of years in the past. We think of thousands of years in the past. And our sort of lived history, our shared history, is discounted as somehow not as important. But then when you see your lived history, your nostalgic memories in a respected museum setting, it kind of validates your story. Like my narrative, my story of home is meaningful. My life was meaningful. My stories are meaningful, and being in that sort of space brought up those emotions for people, I think.
I still can't get over the fact that for many people, the 90s now are what the 50s were to me in the 80s. So, which is a little bit shocking to me.
There were a lot of responses like that.
Because there was a lot of celebrating of the 50s and the 80s, right? I'm thinking of, there were a lot of places that were kind of recreating this vibe. And that's just shocking, but that's just aging, I suppose. I do want to turn things over to our audience for some Q&A. Does anybody want to get nostalgic with us? I think Allie is going to be running a mic around, and since we are live streaming, we ask that you please wait for the microphone to get to you before you ask your question. I think Allie's got you spotted.
Hi. It seems to me that one thing that wasn't addressed tonight is the influence of nostalgia on our contemporary political situation.
Who wants to go there? Well, I think... Greg,
so
the
you
academic.
mean MAGA, Make America Great Again, sort of? Yeah. So, I loved your image of Ronald Reagan because this is not new, this notion of imagining a previous past that somehow was better and clearer and cleaner, and let's return to that. Let's make America great again. It's Morning in America, I think, was one of Ronald Reagan's slogans. And so it points to the ways in which we consistently, for better or for worse, use the past to imagine our present together, to tell the story about our present, and imagine a future. In my world, we call that memory as opposed to history. So we remember something in this moment because we're trying to solve a problem. There's something that's shown up, and we're trying to solve that problem. The really important question, whether it's nostalgia or something else, is what story are we telling and what future are we imagining with that? And we can tell a story, and I would love to have other folks on this panel talk about this. We can tell a story of the past that imagines a more open, robust, kind, humane future. But we often draw on our past to tell other kinds of stories that are more limited, that are more circumscribed. And typically we're seeing successful, at least since Ronald Reagan, stories that feel like they're ones that try to limit the number of identities we're allowed to hold. So I think that nostalgia is working. That let's return to this home. It's important. The last thing I'll say, and then I'd love other people, is that this, and many people have pointed at this, the Make America Great Again, assumes that it was great at some point and that it's not great now. Both of those things are worth talking about, having a conversation about. Was America great at some time? For whom? Under what conditions? And was America really not great 5 years ago? And both of those are complex. Any of these kind of quick kind of slogans shrink all of that. But that's not just true of the contemporary use of the past. That was true of Ronald Reagan. It was true. It's been true before as well. Absolutely. Surely that's part of the motivation of putting on the panel, right? Is to interrogate that piece.
Could you share
Yes.
some of the etymology of nostalgia and how that kind of goes
Sure.
in there?
Yeah, so I talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but and this again is from Svetlana Baum. But this notion of nostalgia, those Greek terms, it's not a Greek word. The Greeks didn't have this word, ancient Greek that's no longer spoken. But in the 17th century, the guy comes up with this phrase, nostalgia. Nos, a return to or return to home, and algia, a longing. What we share in common, many of us, is a longing, a wish, an emotion, an affect. I want to be secure. I want to know my place in the world. I want to get along with people. I want to be successful. By successful in this case, in the case of nostalgia, I want to know that the ways in which I interact are appropriate and correct. To home, but home is different for all of us. And I mean that personally, like I had a particular home with Lauren and Carolyn at 1222 Dewey Drive and blah, blah, blah. And now you can, here's my social security number too. In case you want to steal my credit rating. So I'll just stop there. But I also mean that notion of home, that the idea of home that somebody like me grows up, conservative Christian, evangelical, in a small rural town surrounded by other white folks, is very specific. And so we might share a longing, but the thing that comes after that emotion, is the thing that's different. So we may all agree we want to make America greater, but what we don't agree on is what that greatness looks like.
That was reminded me of, for a couple years I lived in London, and I was in the UK, and I was kind of taken by a few different examples of some of the just cultural differences over there. And one of those was, I was very familiar with all of our U.S. reference and U.S. history that had to do with slavery and agriculture and farming and different eras of industrialization. And they share some of those, but they had also different touchstones. World War II, much bigger touchstone there than I had ever seen around here. Every part of London memorialized World War II, and that was one of the things there. Speakers from politicians to just everyday folks would just always reference World War II for whatever points that they were making, to great effect. That was an absolute major nostalgic touchstone and like reminder and evocative of so many ideas that they were working with. But another difference was how recent they were to their imperial past, and how many living living elders of an older generation that had such fond memories of the great British Empire and all of the greatness that they were bringing to the world. A lot of that was encapsulated inside of the royal family and Elizabeth and all of her eras. I remember meeting professors that started their anthropology career in colonies in Africa. Those were the conditions that they were working with and documenting, you know, all of the colonial happenings and what the natives were doing. And speaking, you know, from those experiences. And it was just a really kind of striking difference, but very common, similar kind of uses of that nostalgia in popular culture and common parlance. And so when Trump did his first term and was doing Make America Great and really leaning into the imperial past, the conquest kind of past, the associating conquest with masculinity and tying that into these cultural images that people were familiar with and get on all those warm and fuzzy feelings. Brexit vote was happening at the same time in the UK to pull themselves out of the European Union. And those conversations were hearkening back to their imperial stuff, to their conquest moments, and their warm and fuzzies as on top of the world and the leader of all directions and this fierce independence and fighting spirit. And it reminded me of all of that talk about empire and then seeing it really applied effectively in the UK for that Brexit vote. And they won that Brexit vote, right? And so very powerful tool for these aims.
And that's a leveraging of nostalgia to manipulate people, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was getting at, is like, how do we protect ourselves from that? And that's kind of what I was getting at. But do you have more to say about that, Jeremy? Or?
No, yeah, I think in many ways, yeah, the positives of nostalgia are strongly individual. You know, the big dangers of it come in this sort of groupthink, for sure. And that's because thoughts of the past are how we interpret events is so individualistic. And I have, like, with the 90s exhibition, that crossed our minds of, you know, how do we interpret these stories? And initially when we summarized the events of each year, it was, and this is why this was important, and this is what this led to. And we realized we don't need to, almost, unless they're Gen Z, everyone who comes to this exhibit already has an opinion about this event. They lived it. You know, they're going to be offended if we tell them how to feel about it. So when we talked about the past that was that close, we did it in the present tense, and we just stated what happened. And we relied on the visitor to talk amongst each other about what that meant to them.
We want to make some time for some more questions here, so do we have any more?
When one of you said something about kind of bridging to the future, if I was listening correctly. Is this, okay.
Get closer to your mouth is better.
Got it. What I wonder about, we all lived through the drive-in and, you know, those cars that didn't have the padded dashboard and we went through the windshields because they weren't, okay. But I wonder about people 40 or 50 years from now, what their nostalgia might be if they lived through, different than we did. They lived through drills in their school about what if there's a shooter. And all we had to do is get under the desk with regard to maybe a nuclear weapon. And we lived in this time of great economic, we didn't see the economic turmoil. So it'll be interesting to see if there's lesser of a hearkening back because of what they lived through when they were our age growing up. Just
My gut reaction to that is I think nostalgia is, I have no data, I have not read Svetlana, but my gut reaction is that nostalgia is tied to youth, and therefore nostalgia will always exist. I don't think it's necessarily that the events of the past were better, it's that youth is better. So when we think of, you spoke a little fondly about flying through the car windshield. And that's probably because you remember, a more vigorous, youthful time. And I think for me, that era is the 90s. When I was planning that exhibit, I was like, I'm pretty sure, like, all the best movies didn't happen in the 90s. But my experience tells me that they did. So, for my nephews, I don't know what they'll look back on fondly, but I'm sure it'll be something. Maybe it'll be TikTok dances or something.
I think another point to remember in thinking about how nostalgia might function in the future, given some of the contemporary traumas that students are going through. And you raise an excellent one with the school shooters and the drills and the being in classroom receiving news that a shooting is happening either nearby or somewhere else in the country, and being on edge. I experienced that with my daughter and the kind of anxiety and fear that she has in school off of just those kinds of things. I think one of the important factors to remember in thinking about how nostalgia will function in the future is that there is a massive machine that can churn out narratives. And so even in thinking about the stuff from the 90s, I remember being bored a lot in the 90s. I wonder where the boredom of my kids are, but there's this machine that's pumping out images, that's consolidating those images into certain types, into certain colors, and then repackaging it and pumping it out frequently, so that whatever our personal sense of things is, there is an independent entity that is creating the narrative of that moment that then gets circulated around. And so I think there'll be a lot of, in the future, a lot of people that are, where those traumas get minimized or they get minimalized or even erased somehow, and it'll just be like personal stories told from parent to child of, well, actually, school shootings were happening all the time. It wasn't a bunch of fun and TikTok dances all the time. And I think that also relates to what you were asking about what could we do when nostalgia gets weaponized against us and used for masking other agendas inside of politics or other areas. And in that respect, I think it also becomes important to think through some of what that concept of Afro-nostalgia was pointing to, of not specifically tied to Black community, but just cultural communities, local communities, community building, and building internal nostalgias, building internal narratives that then become a reference point for nostalgia that can be alternative to the national images, to the machine that's pumping out certain things. And I think there's a whole lot of power inside of the realms that we can control or have an impact in, which tends to be those local spaces. So that and it becomes important for like people growing up and then seeing those kinds of things.
It's a great question, and they've answered it really well. So I don't need to say a lot more. What crucially is that 40 years from now, we can tell whatever story we want. Just like you talked about, our stories today leave out the fact that cars were so deeply problematic 50 years ago, right? The steering wheel was nothing but a spear ready to impale you when you ran into something. We don't talk about that, okay. But the other thing I want to say, though, is this story thing that you just talked about, is that nostalgia has this really powerful emotional component. And if we're concerned about the result of that nostalgia, we can't just tell a truthful story that doesn't have the same emotional content. So I think about, this is going to sound like a critique, and it is kind of, but also the difficulty of this. So in the Oregon Trail story, we have this really embodied experience of like going through the river in these giant balls and et cetera. And we have a piece of paper that says, remember, this was imperialist. That's really emotionally different. That's affectively different. So it's going to last in a different way. And so the question, to come back to your very first question, how do we resist this? How do we tell stories if we don't like the result of the powerful stories we're hearing now? It's not just telling a different story. It has to have emotional balance. It needs to have an equally powerful affect. It needs to feel strongly. Does that make sense? So how do we create that museum exhibit that makes me really feel imperialism? Well, who wants to go to that, right? You can come, by the way, if you want to go to that. Colorado State University Department of Communication Studies hosts a Human Rights Film Festival every April. And that's exactly what it does. And instead of being a nostalgic story of the past, it tells stories of the past, often, for the purpose of imagining a different future, affectively, powerfully. But you get a couple hundred people in a theater, or 50 people in a theater, because it's harder. But that's a piece. I want to really point to how emotionally powerful nostalgia is. And that the response, if we want it to look different, needs to have some sort of emotional power like that.
While you're walking up there, I just want to add that reminded me of this category of storyteller out of a lot of sub-Saharan African traditions known as the griot. That was kind of before written history. The griot was responsible for sharing the past and relating the past, but not in a factual way, not in a dry way, in this like dynamic, performative way that really embodied these historical moments of the clan or of the region, and the whole core to how history was conveyed, to how the past was conveyed, was through this deep emotional attachment. And if it didn't have that emotional attachment, it was lost. And so their responsibility was to find that emotional core and weave these relevant stories of the past and who they were around that. All right, please.
Thank you. First, a quick comment, and then I'll ask my question. The comment is about the 90s exhibit. I took my 10 and 12-year-old daughters, and I have to say that it was a remarkable experience and so much fun for me because I got to both relive my own memories, but also see that this new through their eyes. And the most striking thing, I think, was, what in the world is a videotape, of course, was one. But then the most impressive thing was the beanbag chair with the video game, and they couldn't believe how flat and boring and dry our video games were, but they got plugged in nonetheless, and I had to drag them away. So great job on that exhibit, I do want to say. My question is kind of going a little bit back toward the semi-political part of the equation, but that is sort of the idea of nostalgia as guilt. or the guilt factor related to nostalgia. You know, we were talking about some of the dark parts of history that get forgotten when we think about the warm and cozy past, when we get into our nostalgic modes. You know, and I was thinking, for instance, since we've got some Gen Xers, I was thinking of Ready Player One, and oh my gosh, how much fun is that book and all the references, of which none of it, you know, has any kind of dark connotation to problems that we experienced. And so, you know, as somebody who's a conscientious person who tries to be reflective of the times we're in, you know, the guilt of, I haven't thought of that. I have kind of ignored the bad in my recollections. And also there's kind of a projected guilt from some people, almost saying, hey, you know, the Eisenhower era was so much better than today because this is how this was handled, or this was how this was handled. And so it's kind of a duality there of your own personal guilt for not being more reflective or more aware, and then a projected guilt kind of coming from others trying to your political point, to say, you all should be thinking more towards this model because it was where things were best. So.
Well, I think when you think of the Oregon Trail and the critique on that the guilt is in there, right? There's this sort of difficulty of reconciling what was such a beloved part of your childhood or your memories or things like that, and then the question becomes, is it okay to celebrate that in any way? You know, I think you're probably right that the piece of paper is not sufficient to balance out the sort of positivity of the exhibition of the event. And so you're trying to like help people recognize the guilt that kind of you're referring to, but it's a balancing act of like, how far do you go until you're hijacking the point of this event or your goals as a museum professional. You know, I making this presentation, it's been 8 years since I done that event. I read the page before I put it on there, and I thought, this didn't go far enough. You know, if I had rewritten that, it would have been even stronger in condemning it. And thinking about the event itself, it's like there probably was room to draw on the negative effects from the actual history separate from the computer game. And, you know, at the time, I think our decision was, you know, that's not what this event is, you know. And in a way, then it brings a nostalgic guilt today, you know, of like, oh, I didn't go, was I part of the problem? We talked about pandering before, you know, was that pandering? You know, that's kind of up to the observer.
What you were sharing reminded me of something that my mother would often talk about, growing up in the 60s and getting, feeling a lot of pressure from this like defining decade and this like seminal moment in history, and growing up then in or being a teenager in the 70s and thinking like, oh man, we'll never top the 60s. And like, you know, the guilt of like not being able to carry that forward. Like that she was reflected on that. But then, you know, came around to like, you know, we did all right in the 70s. We have some character that we contributed to things as well. And I, you know, feel some kind of similar things there. With like, you know, the broader sense of guilt, it's a really tricky thing that I think is easier to manage in some spaces than others. One of the difficulties is that we don't really live within a broader structure that is forgiving of the past. We live in a broader structure that like charges through. It doesn't engage things, it doesn't reflect very well. It really just doubles down, triples down, or or amasses a whole new thing to really just push through all of those discomforts, whether you feel comfortable with that pushing or not. And that is, I think it can feel like guilt, but I also think there's a sense of powerlessness that's a part of that, where this thing is just pushing through regardless. It's ignoring a lot of different voices. And so I think in some places it can be a little bit easier because they don't have that machine, or they've overcome that machine in a different way. I've worked in different parts of the world, in like post-colonial places, and they have a little more freedom to criticize the past, to talk about how bad the past was because they had reached a moment of like overcoming those bad things. Where I'm not sure that we've reached like a thing on the other side that we can reflect back and like, oh yeah, those were the bad old days, but here we are now. That makes it difficult, and so it really becomes a thing of keeping those ideas alive, keeping and encountering those truths and carrying them forward until like there is a moment that we can talk about those bad old days and, oh, thank God, isn't it great that we're in a different place now?
A couple things, I hope, quickly. One is as a teacher teaching kind of critical ways of approaching the world, it's not unusual for young people to say, I can't watch TV anymore, I can't listen to music anymore, because now I've just got this critical lens turned on, and we need to move to some places. This is like this, where recognizing that something may not be perfect, but we still can have joy in it. I want to give you a different word from guilt. I'm not trying to say that wasn't your emotion. That's not what I'm saying. That's a great way to just lose. No, your emotion really is something else. But guilt may point us to another emotion that I'm going to call haunt. And I want to just play with that word for just a moment. A haunt can mean, on the one hand, a familiar place, the old familiar haunt, the place from which we came. This is related to nostalgia, actually. There's a long history in which haunt and nostalgia and the uncanny all kind of go together anyway. But haunt is also the return of the repressed. It's the coming back. The haunted house is haunted because something bad happened there, and it's now presenting itself. And it scares me. It disturbs me. And a number of social theorists have talked about the haunt as a way of kind of thinking ethically. Fancy guy by the name of Derrida talked about tarrying with the haunt or with the ghost. So if we come back to this, to the Oregon Trail, there's a sense in which almost nobody can play that game, I think. Very few people can play that game and not have some part of themselves haunted. Now I'm using haunt instead of guilt. Haunted by the other parts of that story, even if I'm not directly acknowledging it. And part of living ethically in today's world with the traumas of our past and our present is to be willing to be haunted, to be scared, to be discombobulated, to be concerned at that emotive level with this other part of the story, this ghost. How do I live with the stranger? And so I wonder, like this is the other part. This is a different part of nostalgia, rather than just this warm, comfortable past. This past to which I wish to return, the old familiar haunt, that is always peopled by ghosts. That I also probably ought to attend to. It's a thought.
I have to say, I think this is a really good place for us to wrap up. I think I hope this is your new haunt, the Longmont Museum. I hope you'll haunt this place over and over and over again. I think we're talking about a willingness to be becoming comfortable with discomfort or something like that. I'm so pleased to see so many people join us this evening for this program, and this conversation. It seems like a very relevant conversation for us to be having this evening, and I hope you learned something. I hope it got you thinking, and I hope to see you again soon for an upcoming program. I want to thank our panelists, Greg, Shanti, and Jeremy, for joining us and for making the trip from the north and the south and meeting us here in the middle. Let's do it again sometime. Don't be strangers. And thank you all for coming.